The diplomatic chamber on Sci-Fi 9 hummed with an eerie stillness, the air thick with tension and the faint, acrid scent of burning incense. The grand obsidian hall stretched high above, its curved walls lined with towering Xiphorian sentinels, their exoskeletal armor gleaming under the artificial glow of the chamber's suspended light orbs. Ambassador Nathan Hale stood at the center of it all, his crisp diplomatic uniform a stark contrast against the dark, towering figures surrounding him. His presence was a singular human silhouette against an overwhelming tide of alien dominance. He had been here before. Negotiation chambers, war councils, uneasy meetings between species who had learned to tolerate one another only at the edge of annihilation. But this time was different. There was no pretense of mutual respect, no veiled efforts at diplomacy. The Xiphorians had already decided. The weight of that realization sat heavy in his gut. Before him, seated on a raised platform of dark alloy, were the High Lords of the Xiphorian Empire. Their elongated forms exuded power, draped in robes woven with the shimmering threads of conquered worlds. Their eyes, glowing pools of pale amber, watched him with the cold amusement of predators toying with their prey. At the center of them stood High Lord Veilzor, his presence even more imposing than the others. His crimson robes cascaded like liquid metal, shifting with every deliberate movement. His ridged face was unreadable, but Nathan knew the look of a creature that had already made its decision. The silence stretched unbearably long, each second a calculated show of dominance. Finally, Veilzor moved, rising with a deliberate grace, his black taloned hands folding before him. When he spoke, his voice was deep and resonant, reverberating through the chamber like distant thunder. "Ambassador Hale," he began, his tone filled with the practiced patience of a being that had crushed entire civilizations beneath its will. "You speak as though your people have a choice. You do not." Nathan's jaw tightened, but his expression remained composed. "Every species has a choice," he countered evenly. "Even under the weight of oppression, resistance exists. You can break the body, but not the will." A low ripple of amusement spread among the High Lords, a chittering, resonant hum that passed between them like an unspoken jest. Veilzor tilted his head slightly. "A poet even now. Fascinating. And yet, your words are as fragile as the worlds that have fallen before us." Nathan felt his heartbeat quicken, though he refused to let it show. Earth is not some nameless colony on the fringes of space. Humanity is not a species of servants to be bartered and broken. We have fought for everything we have, bled for every inch of our place in this galaxy. He let his voice rise, a quiet but firm challenge. "If you think we will kneel, then you do not understand us at all." The air in the chamber grew heavier, charged with something primal. Veilzor stepped down from his platform, each movement deliberate, his armored feet clicking against the obsidian floor. "It is you," he said almost softly, "who does not understand." Nathan had seen this before, posturing, intimidation, the slow tightening of the noose before the final moment of betrayal. But what he had not expected was the sudden, violent movement of the Xiphorian guard beside him. Before he could react, before he could so much as draw breath to protest, the alien's taloned hand lashed out. Pain exploded across Nathan's side as the blow sent him staggering forward, his ribs screaming in protest. Another strike came, a brutal, efficient motion that slammed him to his knees. Blood pooled between his teeth, the taste sharp and metallic. He forced himself to lift his head, meeting Veilzor's gaze without flinching. "So this," he rasped, "is your answer." Veilzor towered above him, his voice quiet but absolute. "This is inevitability." The chamber's towering doors slid open, and from the shadows emerged a pair of Xiphorian executioners, their ceremonial blades humming with a deep, unnatural resonance. The air crackled with energy, the scent of ozone thick as they approached. Nathan exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had always known that peace was fragile, that diplomacy was a blade's edge walked carefully between hope and inevitability. But he had not expected to die today. And yet, there was no fear. Only regret, not for himself, but for what would come after. A single thought cut through the pain, burning with the intensity of a dying star. Darius. The Xiphorians thought they were ending something. They thought this was the final word in the story of Earth's defiance. They had no idea what they had just begun. The first blade struck deep, and the chamber was filled with the sound of a species sealing its fate. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. On the outer edge of the Sol system, aboard the covert operations ship Silent Veil, Darius Hale stared at the transmission feed, his breath frozen in his chest. His father's face, bloodied but defiant, filled the screen. The grainy holofeed crackled with interference, but the message was clear. The Xiphorians had made a spectacle of their execution, broadcasting it across the void as a warning to any who dared oppose them. The video ended. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the distant hum of the ship's systems. Darius sat motionless, his hands clenched into fists so tight his nails bit into his palms. A sharp, burning coldness seeped into his veins, drowning out everything else. They had taken everything from him, and now he would take everything from them. The cityscape of Xipher, 9 stretched endlessly beneath the night, a maze of towering structures woven together by sleek bridges and jagged spires. It was a place where light did not cleanse, but rather deepened the shadows, casting elongated silhouettes of patrol drones and Xiphorian enforcers moving in rigid formations. From his vantage point atop an abandoned comm tower, Darius Hale studied the city with cold precision. The air here was different, thin, metallic, tinged with the acrid scent of burning fuel. Every breath reminded him that he did not belong. The Xiphorian capital was built to be oppressive, a monument to an empire that had spent centuries breaking civilizations and remaking them in its own image. For the first time in its history, however, something had slipped through its walls. A ghost. A reckoning. Darius adjusted the visor of his infiltration mask, activating the tactical HUD embedded within. Streams of alien data scrolled across his vision, mapping enemy patrol routes, security grids, and hidden access points. He had spent the last 2 days slipping through the underbelly of the city, learning its secrets, its weaknesses. Every second had been a lesson in patience. The Xiphorians were efficient, but arrogance had dulled their senses. They had spent so long at the top that they had forgotten to look for threats lurking beneath them. He dropped from his perch, landing silently in the narrow alley below. The air vibrated with the distant hum of surveillance drones, their scanning beams cutting through the darkness like spears of liquid silver. Moving quickly, he slipped between the gaps in their rotations, his movements honed by years of training. The silent rhythm of infiltration was almost comforting, something mechanical, something pure. Reaching the lower levels of the city, he merged with the crowds, pulling the hood of his stolen cloak over his head. Xipher 9 was home to more than just its overlords. Beneath their palaces and command centers, entire districts housed the subjugated. Here, the air was thick with the scent of overworked bodies, the stench of industry and desperation. Factories churned without pause, their workers moving in dead-eyed synchrony. Xiphorian enforcers loomed over them, armed and impassive, their presence a constant reminder of who held the chains. Darius navigated through the throng, his presence unnoticed, his mind focused. The first step of his plan was information. He needed to know the structure of the Overlord's security, their weaknesses, their fears. And for that, he needed the kind of people who thrived in the cracks of empire. The meeting place was buried beneath layers of abandoned infrastructure, an old transport hub that had long since been erased from official records. He moved through the tunnels with caution, his fingers resting lightly against the hilt of his blade. Trust was a currency he did not carry. A set of yellow, reptilian eyes glowed from the darkness ahead. A Dravari, tall, sinewy, with scaled ridges running along his skull. The alien's movements were slow, deliberate, assessing. 2 more figures emerged behind him, one a Korvax, its cybernetic limbs hissing with quiet efficiency. The other a Terran hybrid with a gaze as sharp as a knife's edge. "You're late," the Dravari said, his voice guttural, edged with suspicion. Darius stepped forward, pulling back his hood just enough for the dim light to catch the human angles of his face. I had to be sure you were real. The Dravari's eyes narrowed. And Darius smiled, a slow, humorless thing. I think you're exactly what I need. The room was filled with the smell of oil and damp stone, the walls layered with outdated holo displays, maps, and stolen security feeds. The resistance was small, too small to take on the Empire directly. But they had access. They had knowledge. And that was something Darius could use. He pulled a small device from his belt, activating the projection. A rotating model of SciFi. 9 appeared in the air between them, marked with points of interest, command centers, power grids, military barracks. But one location was pulsing red. The Central Intelligence Hub, Darius said, his voice measured. Every high-ranking officer, every military strategy, every encrypted communication, it all runs through here. The Korvax tilted its head, mechanical eyes whirring. You intend to strike the heart of the Empire. I intend to carve it out, Darius corrected. A heavy silence fell over the room. Even among those who had lost everything, there was a line between defiance and suicide. The Dravari leaned forward, his scaled fingers tapping against the edge of a rusted table. One attack won't collapse the Overlords. They'll retaliate, crush every world that so much as whispers rebellion. Darius met his gaze, unflinching. Then we won't give them time to retaliate. He stepped closer, his voice steady, sharp. You've spent years surviving in the dark, watching your people disappear, waiting for someone else to start a war. But wars don't start with armies. They start with a single act, a moment that shatters the illusion of control. His fingers hovered over the hologram, tapping the intelligence hub's core. This is that moment. The Dravari exhaled, a slow hiss that might have been laughter. You are either very brave or very foolish, human. Darius let the words settle before answering. They took everything from me. Now, I'm going to take everything from them. A beat passed. Then another. The Korvax was the first to move, its mechanical fingers tracing over a secondary console, transferring data. If we do this, we do it clean. No half measures. No retreat. Darius nodded. No retreat. The Dravari let out a low, approving growl. Then it begins. The room shifted with quiet, deadly energy. Weapons were checked, maps adjusted, exits planned. The resistance had moved in shadows for so long, content to survive. Now, survival was no longer enough. Darius stood at the center of it all, his heartbeat slow, measured. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. Tomorrow, the first strike would fall. Tomorrow, the Overlords would learn what it meant to fear. The explosion tore through the Xiphorian intelligence hub with the force of a dying star. The night sky above SciFi 9 lit up as the detonation sent a shockwave rolling through the city, shattering windows, collapsing steel supports, and hurling burning debris in all directions. The once impenetrable fortress of the Overlord's command now stood gutted, its core reduced to molten wreckage. For the first time in centuries, the Empire had been struck at its heart. Darius Hale crouched on a high ledge across the district, watching the destruction unfold through the scope of his rifle. The mission had been executed perfectly. Silent infiltration, explosive charges placed at structural weak points, a coordinated escape through the underground tunnels before the first alarms could wail. The resistance fighters had done their part. Now, the entire Xiphorian war machine would feel the consequences. He didn't stay to admire his work. He adjusted his rifle strap and turned away, disappearing into the city's labyrinthine depths. His mission wasn't over. This was only the beginning. Across the capital, chaos spread like wildfire. Enforcer units scrambled to contain the destruction, their sleek, insectoid forms darting between shattered structures, their weapons primed for an enemy they couldn't see. Xiphorian civilians, those privileged enough to live above the labor districts, emerged from their sterile dwellings, their glowing eyes wide with disbelief. The Empire had taught them that it was unbreakable. The lie had just been shattered. Inside the high citadel, Veil Zor watched the security feeds in silence. The Grand War Chamber, normally filled with quiet efficiency, was now a maelstrom of voices. Generals barked orders, analysts sifted through garbled reports, and tacticians scrambled to make sense of a situation they had never prepared for. Multiple structural failures across Sector 9, one officer reported. His voice edged with panic. The intelligence hub, it's gone. Gone. Veilzor's voice was quiet, but the room fell silent instantly. The officer swallowed hard, his ridged throat twitching. Yes, High Lord. A flickering hologram of the ruins hovered between them. Survivors are limited to the outer perimeters. The central database has been completely obliterated. Encryption backups were compromised in the blast. Another general stepped forward, his tone urgent. High Lord, this was not an accident. The precision, the targeting, it was a strike, a deliberate act of war. Veilzor's fingers curled over the edge of the command dais. The deep, calculated hum of his breathing filled the silence. The Xiphorian Empire had survived countless conflicts, had crushed uprisings before they could fester. But this was different. This was not the work of scattered rebels. This was something surgical. A warrior's work. Surveillance feeds, he commanded. Who did this? The analysts worked quickly, cycling through fractured data streams, reviewing the last recorded moments before the blast. A grainy, heat-distorted feed filled the room. Dark figures moved in perfect synchronization, their shapes humanoid, their weapons precise. Then, as the destruction unfolded, one of them turned, just enough for the feed to capture a single moment of clarity. A human face, cold, determined. Veilzor leaned in slightly. There was something hauntingly familiar in that face. Then, in an instant, the memory surfaced. Nathan Hale. No, not Nathan. Someone younger. Someone whose eyes carried the same defiance, but with something else buried beneath it. Something colder. The realization struck him with an almost unnatural weight. Hale, he murmured, his voice barely audible, but enough to send a ripple through the gathered officers. The sun. A sharp silence fell over the chamber. Xiphorians did not fear, not in the way lesser species did. But a different kind of unease crept through them now. A diplomat's son should have been nothing. A remnant of a failed people, a casualty of history. Instead, he had walked unseen through their capital, torn open their defenses, and left before they could even understand what had happened. The first blow had landed, and it had not come from a fleet or an army. It had come from one man. Veilzor straightened, the dim light of the war chamber casting jagged shadows across his features. Seal the city. Activate planetary lockdown protocols. No ships leave. No transmissions go unmonitored. The officers scrambled to obey, though their movements carried a new tension. They had underestimated humanity once before, treating Earth as an inconvenience rather than a threat. And now, because of that mistake, they had birthed something far worse than resistance. Darius Hale was not a revolutionary. He was not a soldier in a war for freedom. He was something far more dangerous. He was vengeance made flesh. Deep in the lower levels of the city, Darius watched the Xiphorian patrols double in number, watched the transport hubs lock down, watched the Empire tighten its grip in the hope of suffocating something it did not understand. It was already too late. The damage was done, not just to their infrastructure, but to their perception of control. He activated his communicator, speaking into the encrypted channel. They're afraid. A brief pause, then the Dravari's voice crackled through the static. Good. Darius allowed himself a small exhale. Not a smile. Not relief. There was still work to do. He pressed forward into the dark, disappearing once more into the city that now hunted him. The Xiphorian capital burned. Fires raged unchecked through the shattered remnants of the intelligence hub, their smoke curling into the night like the last breath of a dying beast. Sirens howled across the city as enforcers locked down entire districts, dragging suspected conspirators from their homes, interrogating, executing. The Overlords had never faced an attack like this. Not a battle, not an open war, but a single, precise strike that left them blind, wounded, uncertain. Their rage filled the streets like an unholy tide, but beneath their fury lurked something worse. Fear. Darius Hale watched from the shadows, unseen among the chaos he had created. The city felt different now. Before, it had been a fortress, cold and impenetrable. Now it was something else, a wounded animal, lashing out in confusion. He could use that. The encrypted communicator at his belt buzzed. He pressed a finger to his earpiece. "Go ahead." The Dravari's voice came through, hushed but urgent. "We've lost contact with 2 cells in the industrial district. Enforcers are executing suspected dissidents on site." Darius exhaled slowly. He had expected retaliation, but the Xiphorians were moving faster than he had anticipated. The Empire had built itself on terror, and now, faced with its own vulnerability, it was drowning its people in the same brutality that had once kept them obedient. But fear was a dangerous weapon. It had a way of slipping from the hands that wielded it. "We stick to the plan," he said. "The more they tighten their grip, the more control they lose. Stay in the shadows. Keep moving." He ended the transmission and turned his attention to the Citadel. The Overlord's seat of power loomed in the distance, its darkened spires untouched by the flames that devoured the lower districts. He could imagine them inside, their high council chambers thick with the weight of their wounded pride. Veilzor would be at the center of it all, his mind churning through strategies, recalculating probabilities, trying to make sense of an enemy he could not see. Darius didn't intend to give him that chance. He moved swiftly through the ruined alleys, keeping to the shadows as patrol drones passed overhead. Every step brought him closer to the Citadel, to the final strike that would cement the fear already blooming in the Overlord's minds. Then he stopped. A sound faint but unmistakable, the hushed whisper of movement, deliberate and controlled. Darius ducked behind a collapsed column, slowing his breathing, scanning the darkness. Another shift. A shadow among shadows. He moved fast, drawing his blade in a single fluid motion, pivoting just as the attacker lunged. A flash of metal, a Xiphorian combat knife. He twisted, letting the blade slide past his ribs before driving his own weapon upward. The alien hissed, stumbling back, but it wasn't enough to kill. A mistake. More figures emerged from the darkness, their forms shifting in the dim light. Silent, efficient, elite. Darius knew an ambush when he saw one. He moved before they could, dropping a smoke charge at his feet. The street filled with thick, choking vapor as he sprinted toward the nearest escape route, a crumbling service tunnel beneath the old transit lines. He slipped through just as a plasma bolt seared past his shoulder, the heat biting into his flesh even through the armored fabric of his suit. He hit the ground hard, rolling with the impact, his vision swimming as he pushed himself up. Footsteps echoed behind him. They weren't giving up. Good. He led them deeper, into the labyrinth of forgotten tunnels beneath the city, a graveyard of rusted pipelines and abandoned infrastructure. Here, the Xiphorian advantage was useless. No surveillance drones, no high-tech tracking. Just darkness and instinct. Darius moved fast, weaving through the passageways, listening to the way his pursuers adjusted, recalculated. They were trained, disciplined. But he had spent years learning how to kill creatures who thought they were untouchable. He cut left, then right, then stopped. The tunnel split ahead, 2 paths diverging into blackness. Without hesitation, he took the right. Then he doubled back, pressing himself into the shadows just as the Xiphorians rushed past, following the false lead. Idiots. Darius waited, counting his breaths, until the last of them disappeared. Then, without a sound, he moved again. Minutes later, he surfaced in a quiet, abandoned district on the outskirts of the city. The fires still raged in the distance, but here all was silent. He touched his communicator. "I ran into a problem," he said. The Dravari's response came quickly. "We saw the enforcers moving. Thought you were dead." "Not yet." Darius looked toward the Citadel, still untouched, still standing. "But not for long. They're hunting now. That means we hit them harder." A pause. Then the quiet rumble of approval. "What's the next move?" Darius tightened his grip around the hilt of his blade. "We finish what we started. Tomorrow, the Citadel would fall. Tomorrow, the Empire would bleed.